The President of the United States of America is known to be one of the most powerful positions in the world, as they're the leading figure of the United States of America we all see today. And they're the head of government and head of state, or the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, as they lead our country proud. And the President is elected to the hilariously overcomplicated and very controversial Electoral College. So let us begin. After winning independence from Great Britain in 1776, the newly formed United States of America had just recently unanimously elected a very known founding father, George Washington. After being sworn in on the 30th of April, 1789, he served 2 4-year terms, and he chose the location of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., just in between Maryland and Virginia, and the Potomac River. Wait, a city named after him? Where did that come from? Washington's vice president and fellow founding father John Adams then later became the second president of the United States of America, and he would become the first president to live in what is now the U.S. Parliament Building, or as many like to call it, the White House. During what would become the Napoleonic Wars, Adams sided with the British while his political opponents in his opposing party sided with the French. This also led to the Quasi-War with France, which was kind of a bit dark. Adams clamping down on the freedom of speech was what led to him losing a second term against his old rival, number 1. Thomas Jefferson. As another founding father, he eventually founded the Democratic Republican Party for a reason. He also wrote the Declaration of Independence way back 25 years earlier, giving birth to the United States of America. Earlier in 1803, Jefferson tried to eventually buy the French city of New Orleans from France, but Napoleon suggested he buy the entire French Louisiana territory for $15 million, knowing that Britain would try to take it. So Jefferson agreed and bought it for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. Jefferson then later managed to push through the natives to the west, and he banned the import of slaves from Africa. Both Jefferson and Adams died on July 4th, which is America's birthday, and in the same year of 1826. Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." But that wasn't true, since Jefferson eventually died 4 hours earlier, and so when they met in heaven, they had nuclear weapons to kill each other. James Madison was next, and he was another founding father who helped write the Constitution of the United States. His presidency oversaw one of America's most forgotten wars in history, the War of 1812, in which the United States went to war against Canada, a British imperial colony in the north, for 3 straight long years. In 1813, the United States burned down Canada's capital, Toronto, and so in 1814, in retaliation, Canada burnt down America's capital, Washington, D.C., which was the only time D.C. had ever been held by a foreign power. Sad. In the end, both sides agreed to stop fighting in 1815. Madison then later pushed for a stronger government, stronger military, and a national bank. James Monroe was the last founding father to be president of the United States. His presidency oversaw the era of good feelings, which saw Monroe trying to unify the country under peace and pressure. This also led to him making the idea of an American global empire. Later that flopped. Monroe also bought what would later become my home state of Florida from Spain. This also led to him compromising with slavery in Missouri and supported the establishment of an area in West Africa for freed slaves, which would later become Liberia. Son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, became the 6th president and became the first president to have a father as president. Holy crap, that's amazing. He won a top 4-way race, but it was the House of Representatives that declared him the winner. As cheaper products were rolling in, northern industries were in deep danger. Adams brought in tariffs and, I don't know what to say. Adams, however, lost a second term in 1828. However, it was by someone else, and not the Democratic Republican. As the Democratic Republican Party was dismantled and dissolved and crushed. Oh, crap. And out of its wounds came a new political party, one that would be downright evil, nasty, destructive, downright behavior beyond the great ideas. A new political party had risen to its imperial ashes, a political party called the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson was the first to ever hold that political party, and he would become one of, if not the, craziest president in the United States of America. Jackson faced secession threats from South Carolina as she complained that the tariffs brought him by Adams were not even fair. So Jackson brought down the tariffs and threatened military action. South Carolina was a bit scared and didn't want to get attacked, so she chose not to secede. He also dismantled the Second Bank in the United States, posing as a bit of a hero. He also signed the Indian Removal Act, beginning the infamous Trail of Tears. Ouch. During the election of 1828 against John Quincy Adams, Jackson's supporters criticized Jackson for being a jackass. Wait, what? However, Jackson took it personal and made it to the symbol of the Democratic Party we see to this day, as portrayed by a donkey. Jackson was known for his temper and love of duels, but not this one. This one. Vice President Martin Van Buren was seen as a pretty useless president. He was blamed for the Panic of 1837, as it was a recession in the United States that had already happened. Texas gained independence from Mexico in 1836. However, Van Buren refused to annex it to the Union because he did not want to start a war with Mexico. William Henry Harrison was the last president born before America's independence and birth. He made a 2-hour inaugural address during his inauguration on March 4th, 1841. However, just 31 days into his presidency, he died of pneumonia. Ouch. There were questions for what would happen next, but not for Vice President John Tyler, who had himself sworn in, becoming the 10th President of the United States. Tyler completed the rest of Harrison's 4 years, but ironically didn't want to serve a second. The newly formed Whig Party that was set up to fight back against the Democrats had wanted the National Bank back again, but Tyler ultimately refused, causing many of his own cabinet to resign. Sad. James K. Polk was one of America's most successful presidents. His presidency oversaw the Mexican-American War, in which the United States went to war against Mexico over the U.S. annexation of Texas, when Mexico refused it. And Polk was victorious, and the U.S. was victorious. And they took huge swaths of land from Mexico in 1848. There was also a border dispute between the United States and Canada, and ultimately enough, James K. Polk said, "Let's draw a line." And so there was the border between the United States and Canada, which is to this day. Crazy. Polk only promised to serve only one term, and he did. However, just only 3 months after he left office, he died of cholera. Ouch. Worst retirement ever. Mexican-American war hero Zachary Taylor was next, and he was not much of a politician. There was bitter political divide over the Union, as freedom dominated the North, while slavery dominated the South. But would it be allowed? Would it? Taylor mostly stayed out of it, because why not? But it wouldn't even matter anyways, because Taylor died. Ouch. Vice President Millard Fillmore took office, and he did manage to ease a bunch of tensions about slavery and hold it down a bit. And he also looked to open trade with Japan, which isolated itself for hundreds of years. Wow. Fillmore sought re-election, but ended up failing poorly along with William Field Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War. Because of this, the Whig Party ended up collapsing, as it had no more losses to take. And apparently, it faded away in 1853, after Fillmore had left office. But a new political party would go on to rise up against the Democrats. And in the Whig Party's place, there will be a new political party stopping slavery at every turn, and bring down the Democrats and their evil legislative ideas. A new political party that we know today as the Republican Party. Franklin Pierce is often seen as one of America's worst presidents, and he was elected to unite North and South, as he was a Democrat, from the North. But because Pierce was Democrat, instead he ended up supporting slavery, and some big examples of this were him supporting the Fugitive Slave Act and Kansas-Nebraska Act. This resulted in bloody conflict in Kansas, as many anti- and pro-slavery settlers fought against each other, in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. But ironically, Pierce's actions would lead to even more political divide in the country. James Buchanan was another one of America's worst presidents. And he did nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop the political divide in the U.S. over slavery from crumbling any further. Crazy, isn't it? Towards the end of Buchanan's presidency, 11 out of the 15 southern slave states decided to leave from the Union by seceding. Apparently, the 11 following were Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, the first one to actually secede, North Carolina, her northern brother, Virginia, the leader of the pack, and finally, without a doubt, the most important one I've been saving for last, my home state, Florida. All of these 11 states together had banded together, forming a new country called the Confederate States of America, declaring independence from the United States in reaction to the election of the rising Republican Party candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is arguably seen as America's greatest president ever, and he's usually the most popular out of all of them. Really, he is really popular. Ever since he took office in March, things have been really hectic, and after the Confederacy gained independence, just a mere 5 weeks after Lincoln was sworn in, the Civil War broke out. On the opposite side, former Senator of Mississippi Jefferson Davis became the first and only president of the Confederacy. The war lasted for 4 bloody long years, and the Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in American history. In 1862, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederacy. Shortly after, in June of 1863, West Virginia separated from Virginia, joining the Union. It was there that the famous Battle of Gettysburg would begin in July, where Robert E. Lee, the commander of all Confederate armies, sent out his army in Northern Virginia, fighting their way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. It was there that George Meade, a Union general, sent out his Army of the Potomac to meet with Lee and his army. It was there that the bloody Battle of Gettysburg would commence. The battle would see the most vicious fighting to ever date, and the Union would be suffering its most casualties throughout, as well as the Confederacy. It saw the most casualties out of any battle in the United States, or was. I may need to look on Google again. But anyways, it's the most popular battle, man. Wow, this battle was epic. I cannot believe that this battle was so epic. Can you believe it, guys? That's crazy. Crazy, guys. After the battle's end, which resulted in Union victory, Lincoln was at the battlefield, where he eventually delivered his famous Gettysburg Address.
"47 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal."
Lincoln was re-elected for a second term in the 1864 election, defeating George McClellan, a Confederate Union traitor. In April of 1865, Jefferson Davis evacuated the Confederate capital Richmond as it was being taken over by Union forces. Shortly after, Robert E. Lee had no choice but to give in. In Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, the commander of all Union armies in Appomattox, ending the war. 5 days after the fall of the Confederacy, Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends in Ford's Theater. However, on that very same evening, a Maryland doctor and Confederacy sympathizer, John Welsh Booth, snuck into the theater as he was upset about the South's defeat and Lincoln's victory in the war. So he snuck into the president's box in revenge, and in one of the worst things that ever happened to the United States. No, wait, the worst thing that's happened to the United States. Booth shot President Lincoln. Shortly after, President Lincoln passed away the very next day. Today, he is remembered to be America's greatest president, but he was the first president, sadly, to be assassinated, which is when somebody is murdered without even looking at the killer. Today, Lincoln stands as our most popular president. Some say it's George Washington, but to me, it's Lincoln. He is the reason I chose the Republican Party. He is the reason why all of us remember him well. And he will live on in heaven forever. Rest in peace, Thomas Tape. God bless America. Vice President Andrew Johnson took over, and he was seen as one of America's most tyrannical presidents. And he would go through the Reconstruction era, which saw Reconstruction to the southern states as they were being readmitted to the Union one by one. Johnson also oversaw the Alaska Purchase of 1867, in which the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia.
Is that beer I smell?
Congress tried to bring civil rights and other acts that would help the Union, but Johnson decided to veto them like an idiot. Johnson tried vetoing many things, some of which had Congress's 2/3 majority pushing it through anyways. Congress also tried to pass the 14th Amendment, but Johnson vetoed it again, and eventually went too tyrannical on Congress, I believe. He went too tyrannical on Congress and fired, some type of, member of Congress and breaking, the Office of Tenure Act. Yeah, the Office of Tenure Act. Shortly after, Congress and the radical Republicans decided to finally put their foot down. And so in 1868, Johnson became the first ever president in U.S. history to face impeachment. That's when the U.S. House of Representatives calls in favor of removing the president from office. And if all said and done with articles of impeachment, the president is impeached. Shortly after, it's up to the Senate to decide. Depending on what political party the president is, the Republicans and Democrats, vote guilty or not guilty, as there are 100 senators total. Or independents. I do like the Bernie Sanders meme, though. Then, in the impeachment trial in the Senate, unlike the House, who, whatever's the most wins, it's not in the Senate. Instead, it's a certain number on whether, the president is guilty or not guilty. If there are 67 guilty votes, the president is convicted and removed from office. But if there are 34 not guilty votes, the president is acquitted and allowed to stay in office. And Johnson was acquitted, but by just one tiny margin. Former Civil War commander of all Union armies, Ulysses Grant, was next, and he worked to put down Confederate nationalism in the reconstructing states during Reconstruction. He also supported the gold standard, which we haven't been on for quite a while. Wow. Grant also tried to annex the city known as Santo Domingo, today in the Dominican Republic. I don't know why, but he wanted to. And it backfired. He also defended the country from corruption and quarreled with the Native Americans. With the Panic of 1873, Grant's popularity easily waned towards the end of his presidency. By midnight of the 1876 election, Samuel J. Tilden was supposed to win. However, by midnight, he only got one vote away from receiving the presidency. And with disputed electoral votes, it was Rutherford B. Hayes that got the election with the exact same amount, winning by just one vote. However, many argued about this because, he won the popular votes but lost the election. Apparently, it was a very controversial one. But to make the Democrats happy, the Republicans easily ended military control in the southern states, eventually ending Reconstruction. He also put down the railroad strike of 1877 as a bit of a bonus. Like Polk back in 1849, Hayes only promised to serve once again one term, which he did. James A. Garfield was seen as a bit of a comeback president. He managed to eventually improve the U.S. Navy a lot, and sort out corruption very much a lot. He also managed to improve the rural ideas and support education and civil rights for many of the black people. But he was not to last. On the very day of July 2nd, 1881, a gunman named Charles J. Guiteau, who was a disgruntled wannabe office holder, shot President Garfield multiple times because Garfield did not give him a job. What an idiot! Just 2 months later, Garfield died. Ouch. Vice President Chester A. Arthur took office, and he did more to reform the positions based on merits, but not political parties. During his presidency, he managed to eventually inherit a lot of huge federal surpluses and many loads of money spending on U.S. harbors. Grover Cleveland, despite being a Democrat, had growing support from the opposite party. And he was very conservative too, pushing for big businesses inside the United States of America. He also tried to assimilate many Native American tribes by taking some of their land and easily dividing them up into allotments and selling it back in return for the U.S. citizens to have land. Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of 9th President William Henry Harrison, becoming the only president possibly in the U.S. history to have a grandpa as president. Remember when I stood back at that surplus thing? Well, let's rewind. During his presidency, he managed to eventually inherit a lot of huge federal surpluses and many loads of money spending on U.S. harbors. Well, Harrison, unlike Arthur, decided to spend it all, but only for forests. He was another U.S. president who oversaw the modernizing U.S. Navy since the Civil War. He also proposed federal education and voting rights also for the black people. But many politicians who were tired of the issue didn't want to support it at all. Harrison tried to fight for re-election, but was soundly defeated by what the
Guess who's back? Grover's back.
Apparently, Grover Cleveland returned as the 24th, becoming the only president so far in U.S. history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Shortly after was the Panic of 1893, which Cleveland was unable to stop. William McKinley was the 25th president, and throughout the end of the 19th century came along with gold and silver standards, as well as more wealth that could be spread amongst the country. But McKinley resisted this instead. McKinley was also famous for leading the United States against Spain and her empire in the Spanish-American War. And the U.S. was victorious in the war, ending Spain's global empire that she ruled over for hundreds of years. By 1898, the U.S. had finally gained the 2 U.S. territories of Guam and Puerto Rico that we still own to this day. Shortly after, they also tried to gain the Philippines, which they decided to let go in 1947. Not to mention Cuba gaining its ultimate independence from Spain the same year, in 1898. It was around this time that Hawaii was annexed to the United States. But then one day, September 6th, McKinley was traveling to Buffalo, New York, when suddenly, as he was shaking hands with some locals, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz shot President McKinley twice. Just 8 days later, McKinley died. Ouch. Ripperino. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt took office, and at the age of 42, he was the youngest president ever in American history. Roosevelt was also known to be famous for, building monuments and parks. But he's even more famous for ending the Russo-Japanese War, becoming the first person to win the Nobel Peace Prize for doing so. He was also famous for construction of the Panama Canal and led the country in the Progressive Era, along with the very known Square Deal. His nickname, Teddy, meanwhile, became the source of the name of the teddy bear for some reason. That's a nice name. Roosevelt's old friend and colleague, William Howard Taft, was next, and he was originally thought to be Roosevelt as Roosevelt 2.0. But right off the bat, he was pretty tyrannical. He fired many cabinets that Roosevelt appointed. Yeah, cabinet members. Why were they fired? Apparently, Taft was way too out of control, and Roosevelt had to stop him. So he decided to leave the Republican Party and join the new Progressive Bull Moose Party. And eventually, in 1912, the two were dead even. The fighting went on for way too long, and it was terrible. Roosevelt and Taft had each other dead even, and the fighting would never stop. But there had to be one person, who could possibly end the fighting. And most of you guys probably forgot about this because I distracted you with this whole Roosevelt and Taft talk. You guessed it, the Democrats. It was Democrat Woodrow Wilson who stopped the fighting, and he managed to rule over Congress along with his own party. And he also passed the Federal Reserve Act and Farm Loan Act, and income tax. His presidency oversaw World War I, in which a Serbian nationalist named Gabriel Princip shot the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, while Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. So Germany declared war on Russia, and so France, then later Britain, declared war on Germany. It was essentially one big chain reaction that started off a bloody mechanized war. And it was the dawn of modern warfare after all. Wilson tried keeping the US out of it eventually. However, Germany did something very smart. They thought it would work by sending something called the Zimmermann telegram, in which he sent a Zimmermann telegram to the volatile Mexico to help Mexico get its revenge after that recent Mexican-American war that they've had. And it failed poorly as the British intercepted it and showed it to America, and that was the final straw, and the US was now in the war. In the end, Germany fully surrendered after one too many blows in 1918. Wilson suffered one too many strokes toward the end of his presidency, and some even joked because his wife Edith managed to fill in for him towards the end of his presidency, some even joked in calling her the first female president. But that's false. Towards the end of the war, the U.S. made loads of money from World War I, and Wilson set up the Treaty of Versailles for a reason. And he also set up the League of Nations, causing him to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's really cool, I guess. Also, towards the end of his presidency, Wilson ratified the 19th Amendment, thus giving women the right to vote. Took you long enough. Warren G. Harding was one of America's most popular presidents. Well, at least in life. And it was quite clear why Harding was a bit scandalous at sometimes. However, just 2 years into his presidency, Harding died of a heart attack. Ouch. Ripperino. After Vice President Calvin Coolidge took over, he discovered that Harding's staff had been involved in huge corruption such as bribery, private oil companies, and a lady that was not even his wife. Oh, God. Therefore, Coolidge decided to distance himself from him like always. He was also known to be the first president to broadcast on the radio. That's pretty cool. His presidency oversaw the Roaring Twenties, which is a time of luxury and lavish time of their lives in the U.S. It was a good time. However, it wasn't even to last throughout the end of the 1920s. Herbert Hoover easily had a very popular presidency for the first 7 months. Yeah, I said first 7 months because something happened. On the very day of October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday, the Wall Street stock market in New York crashed. And so began the Great Depression, which not only spread across the U.S., but across the world. Oh, crap. But most people didn't even know about this, but I did. The Great Depression easily hurt the United States so hard, and unemployment was skyrocketing, and suicide rates were skyrocketing as well. Hoover tried to make things better by setting up more taxes.
Oops.
But it just made the Depression worse for some reason. I don't know why, but it did. In an attempt to try and ease things down a bit, Hoover had the Hoover Dam built, but it only made things worse for some reason. Today, it still remains here in the U.S. This seriously hurt Hoover's reputation, and it would lead to the Democrats winning another landslide. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was next, defeating Hoover in a landslide in 1932, although not to be confused with Teddy Roosevelt. But fun fact, FDR is actually a fifth cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. How cool is that? Roosevelt signed a New Deal, which eventually involved more federal involvement in the U.S. economy and boosted it very far. He also signed the Gold Reserve Act, eventually preventing the gold standard from trickling down the U.S. dollar and helping the economy get going again. During his presidency, Roosevelt suffered from polio, which according to Google is a deadly virus that can cause paralysis. And Roosevelt easily had no detain to stop it, apparently. He did try to hide it from the public by using his son and a walking stick and not wanting to appear weak to the public. Roosevelt's presidency initially oversaw World War II, in which Germany easily took over most of Europe, and Britain wasn't even feeling any much better since the fall of France in 1940. Roosevelt ultimately stayed out of the war initially, but did supply Britain with weapons and ammunition. Shortly after was the Battle of Pearl Harbor, in which Japan, a close friend of Germany by the way, attacked the U.S. naval post of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This resulted in FDR declaring war on not just Germany, but also Japan.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Roosevelt worked with many Allied leaders during the war and would set up what would later become the United Nations. Roosevelt easily became the first and only U.S. president to serve more than 2 terms. Oh my gosh. He spent a record 4 terms in office. However, just a month into his 4th term, and a mere 12 days before Germany's final breath and collapse, Roosevelt died of cerebral hemorrhage. Ouch. Sad. Vice President Harry Truman then later took office, and he oversaw the end of World War II with Germany's final collapse. And at the start of his presidency, Truman dropped 2 atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities, one of them being in Hiroshima, the other being in Nagasaki. And so Japan finally surrendered fully, and the war with Japan in the Pacific was over. But by the end of the war, that doesn't mean peace has rolled around finally to the world. Instead, after the end of the war, there were 2 superpowers left, one of them being the land of the free and the home of the brave we all know today. Isn't that right, guys? The other being the sinister Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. And Truman moved to stop the spread of communism, beginning the 44-year-long Cold War. The war oversaw many events, such as the Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, and the establishment of NATO. He also served the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, National Security Agency, and Department of Defense. That's pretty cool. Earlier in 1796, George Washington was offered a 3rd term, but he turned it down because he doesn't want to serve another term. Plus, it wouldn't even matter anyway because he died just 2 years after he left office. However, just shortly after, many other 2-term presidents managed to follow in his footsteps by not serving a 3rd term. And there were so many that did not want to serve a 3rd term, except for FDR. However, Truman, despite this, in 1947, decided to make the footsteps of George Washington official by signing the 22nd Amendment, limiting the presidency to 2 4-year terms. Towards the end of Truman's presidency came the Korean War between communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea. In the end, it was a stalemate, but that would be inherited by his successor. Former World War II General Dwight D Eisenhower was next, and he fully ended 20 long years of Democratic control in the White House. Whew, finally that took a long while. Throughout the war, both sides have been constructing nuclear weapons, and there are many interventions involving both of them. There are many proxy wars throughout the world. Yeah, it was one hell of a war, wasn't it? He also tried standing up against the newly formed People's Republic of China, which was communist and a colony of the Soviet Union. Wonder which one's the real one. He also been criticizing France, Britain, and Israel in the Suez Crisis, forcing them to pull out of Egypt, like an idiot. Why, Eisenhower, why? Shortly after came the space race, which started off as the Soviets launched Sputnik into space. Shortly after, Eisenhower set up NASA, which was still out to this day. Shortly after, Cuba was overthrown by some communists and became a colony of the Soviet Union throughout. Eisenhower tried to wage war, but it ended up just being a disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion for some reason. John F. Kennedy was the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. His presidency oversaw the erection of the Berlin Wall, dividing East and West Berlin for good. Shortly after came the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a stressful 12 days that Kennedy had to go through, as the USA and the USSR were on the brink of World War III with nuclear war imminent on each other. However, things fully escalated down quickly, and the world breathed one huge sigh of relief after this. Phew, we almost died. Seriously, I almost died too. And I wasn't even alive at this date, wasn't I? Kennedy also oversaw civil rights, and eventually it gave equal rights to African Americans. Kennedy, however, would meet his end on November 22nd, 1963, as in a week-long 5-day trip in Texas, Kennedy eventually was traveling in Dallas, one of the cities. Shortly after, Kennedy was riding in a rental car, when suddenly, in an apartment like that was a few stories high, a communist gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald came up from a very high, tall levitation. Eventually, with his own sniper, he shot Kennedy once in the back, exiting by his throat, and the other, a headshot. But still, I feel bad. Just 30 minutes later, Kennedy died. Ouch. Ripperino. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson then later took over, and he was a bit of a domineering person at least. He did manage to end much of segregation, eventually giving rights to the African American people finally. During the 2-decade-long Vietnam War, Johnson managed to put even more ground troops over there, and it dragged on and on. There were also many riots that were stoked by the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Sad. Johnson, of course, wasn't even seen to do much about it. Richard Nixon was arguably seen as another one of America's worst presidents. Nixon eventually visited communist China and had been working relations with the Soviet Union in a time known as détente. Shortly after, Nixon removed all ground troops from Vietnam in what became known as the end of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Shortly after, just 2 years later, South Vietnam fell. This is why I consider Nixon to be a communist, alright? But his presidency was most infamously remembered by the Watergate scandal, in which his administration broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in D.C. There, they applied secret recordings during the revelations that would follow. Shortly after, they were busted. Nixon was forced to give up the recordings, and shortly after, it was a mess. And fearing he was going to face impeachment by the House of Representatives, Nixon became the first and possibly the only president to resign.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Vice President Gerald Ford then later took office, and towards the beginning of his presidency, managed to pardon Nixon and sign the Helsinki Accords, which improved relations between East and West. Although Ford was Nixon's vice president, he wasn't actually chosen by the Electoral College. The guy before him was Spiro Agnew. I mean, he had the best name, not gonna lie. Agnew did resign in 1973 after fearing one too many scandals that McKinley was governor of Maryland and many of his own bribes and corruptions. So, after Ford became Nixon's vice president, when Nixon resigned, Ford eventually took his place. So Ford really was the only president or vice president to not have been elected by either office, you know? There were many recessions during Ford's presidency, one too many, and Ford tried seeking re-election, but ended up failing very poorly instead to former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. Carter was a bit seen as one of America's most mediocre presidents, but at least I still think he has some stability. For starters, he oversaw the 3 Mile Island accident, which is kind of dark. Shortly after, another dark event came along, and there was the Iran hostage crisis, where 52 Americans were held hostage to Iran for about roughly 444 days. Carter also oversaw the SALT II agreements, which were never ratified because of the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, thus ending détente. Shortly after, the United States said, "Hell no, I'm not going to accept your invite to the 1980 Olympics. Attend it yourself, man. I'm not even trying." Dude, are you kidding me? I wanted us to have differences. During his presidency, Carter set up a thing eventually setting up for environmental issues and human rights in what became known as the Carter Center. This allowed him to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. Also, fun fact, as of current day, Carter is still alive at the age of 96. Wow. Carter, however, ended up losing re-election very poorly to former California governor and Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan. Reagan is seen as another one of America's most popular presidents, and towards the beginning of his presidency, survived an assassination attempt. Wow, that's amazing. He did try increasing the war on drugs, which is either a plus or a negative. I never really looked into it that much. Another blunder during his presidency was ignoring the AIDS epidemic, which is not a pandemic, let me tell you, but an epidemic. There's a huge difference. Today it's an endemic, which is a pandemic or epidemic that never ends. I think COVID-19 is an endemic, but really low. I think it's starting to decrease into becoming an epidemic that's an endemic. I don't know. But anyways, by the end of his second term in his presidency, more than 70,000 people were dead. Oh, crap. He did push for ending the Cold War, but not before escalating it even further with some ballistic missiles and space lasers. Wait, what? Reagan also tried to arm the Mujahideen in Pakistan, some of which were going to form... Oh my god, I'll explain later. Reagan did challenge Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to try and tear down the Berlin Wall, and months after his presidency would end in 1989, the wall finally came down. Finally, that's over with. Vice President George H.W. Bush took office, and he easily oversaw the invasion of Panama, deposing Manuel Noriega. His presidency also oversaw the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War with victory of the United States. Bush, however, faced a tougher path to re-election, which was harder than he thought. Bush, back in 1988, when he was first elected, defeating Michael Dukakis, promised he was not going to raise taxes.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
And what did Bush do during his presidency? Why, all these things that I listed down here, according to a Clinton Gore ad I saw on YouTube. Bush should have been flying high after kicking ass in the Persian Gulf War, but ironically, there was also a sudden recession and a poorly economic recovering economy. Of course, this would all lead to Bush losing his campaign for a second term altogether against Arkansas Governor William Jefferson Clinton, or Bill Clinton for short. Clinton saw the longest period of peace and economic growth in the country, and towards the beginning of his presidency, he signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, which gave rights to free trade to the United States, his old rival Mexico, and his fiancée Canada. Apparently, it was all prosperities for the 1990s, apparently. He also managed to reform welfare and sign for health insurance for many children beyond. However, in 1998, Clinton became the second president to face impeachment for lying about sexual relations with White House intern Monica Lewinsky in what became known as the Lewinsky scandal. Hey, isn't that my mother's name? Thankfully, though, Clinton was acquitted. There was a bunch of surplus toward the end of Clinton's presidency, but wait a second. Since when did he play the saxophone? I don't remember that. What? George W. Bush, son of George H.W. Bush, became the 43rd, and he became the second president since John Quincy Adams to have a father as president. Holy crap, I can't believe that. He won a ridiculously close election against Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, all of which happened over my home state of Florida. Wait, what? Only months after Bush eventually began his presidency came 9/11, in which on the very day of September 11th, everything was going fine in New York. However, the unthinkable happened. At that moment, an airplane full of passengers crashed into one of the two World Trade Center Twin Towers in Manhattan, New York. So many people on the building and on the plane had lost their lives over that crash. Shortly after, a second plane flew into the other tower, and it was a mess. Shortly after, two extra hijacked planes came along. One of them hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The other, well, it was most likely to hit another building in D.C., but legends say that many people tried to eventually take back control. But in the chaos, it caused another plane to crash in an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Shortly after, as we all watched at 9:03 or 10:28 or whatever, everything went downhill. At that very moment, both the World Trade Center Twin Towers collapsed. All told, an estimated 3,000 people lost their lives on that very day. Rest in peace, young ones. In response, Bush declared war on Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization responsible for that mess, along with the Taliban government in Afghanistan, in what became known as the War on Terror. Bush had a blunder during his presidency, though, as he falsely accused Iraq of being involved in the 9/11 attack, and also accused Saddam Hussein of housing nuclear biological weapons, but that was false. Despite being re-elected for a second term, defeating Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, Bush's popularity waned throughout the end of his second term, as he handled not only the war in Iraq badly, but also the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Wait, what? He also oversaw the Great Recession, which wasn't even helping, you know? But even after his presidency's end, Bush still remains popular to this day, and apparently, he's seen as a very popular figure throughout the United States. I mean, just look at this. I don't want to play this game. Barack Obama was the first African-American president of the United States. Being born in Hawaii, he was the first president to not be born in the continental U.S., and he has a birth certificate to prove it. Obama was the first president to really use the media to his advantage. And he really managed to do a lot of media, apparently, including my beloved YouTube, which I still have to this day. When you're watching it right now, apparently. Right? Obama is also famous for signing the newly formed Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. Wow, pretty cool. He also bombed Libya against the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi. He also managed to order the operation of killing Osama bin Laden, the main dude responsible for 9/11. He also had a drone strike in Afghanistan against the Taliban government, as well as northern Pakistan, for some reason. I don't really want to talk about what happened next because, oh boy. His presidency also oversaw Black Lives Matter, an entire movement which would give equal rights to African Americans. And it wouldn't even spread across the U.S., but across the world for some reason. Obama remains as one of the most greatest presidents, mainly not because he's African American, but all the things he's accomplished during his presidency. Didn't he now? Donald Trump was the 45th, and a very controversial president, as despite being a racist, misogynistic bully, and liar, he convinced half the nation to vote for him, apparently. Actually, more than half the nation. However, he became the 5th president only to win the election despite losing the popular vote for some reason. And I oversaw it. That's right. This was the first election I was alive to witness. I easily oversaw the 2016 election between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton, the wife of Bill, who became the first female presidential candidate of the United States. Literally. Towards the beginning of his presidency, Trump promised to drain the swamp, which would end the corporate bankers. Trump also set up the Trump travel ban for some reason, ending traveling in Muslim countries for some reason. Trump also was the first U.S. president to step inside North Korea, visiting Kim Jong-un in the demilitarized zone. One of the most funniest reasons I actually love Trump is that he's kind of famous for building a wall around the Mexican border. Big wow. He also pushed the phrase fake news and actively spoke out against sources from the media, allowing his followers to go against the media. Personally, I was not against the media, but that's Trump. It's what he does. He also supported the recognition of Jerusalem being Israel's capital. He also announced the creation of the Space Force, a new branch in the U.S. Armed Forces. In 2019, Trump became the 3rd president to face impeachment. This time for housing a big corrupt scandal with Ukraine, eventually helping hurt political rivals' campaign. But he was acquitted. Shortly after, U.S. military forces in 2020 assassinated Iranian military leader Qasem Soleimani, which nearly sparked World War III. but thankfully things escalated down very quickly. I did make a scenario video in World War III in September of last year, but its cause was a different story behind Ukraine and Russia. Plus, it was during Obama's presidency, right? From January 1st, which is New Year's, to April 3rd, which is my birthday. I'm not kidding. April 3rd is my birthday, which is coming up. Soon I'll be 15. Anyways, I was having the time of my life, apparently. It was like the roaring 20s in my perspective. However, on April 3rd, everything went to a halt as COVID-19 came along and ruined everything. COVID-19 easily destroyed my life entirely. And COVID was easily a pandemic, apparently. The coronavirus lasted for way too long, and it was never going to end. Many people declared it to be an endemic afterwards, up to this day. Many criticized President Trump for eventually making things worse. And by January 20th this year, over 400,000 deaths appeared across the United States. Boy, this is just terrible. Just completely terrible. Wow. Many of Trump's diehard supporters believed in the QAnon conspiracy, and also believed Trump was going to be their savior in America. In 2020, Trump was fighting for re-election, and many of his diehard supporters said, 4 more years! 4 more years! And I did too, apparently. It was a blast. I was expecting Trump to eventually win, and it took 4 days to get the results by Election Day. However, my expectations, despite everything I tried to get Trump to win, didn't work. Trump, despite everything he has done to win, instead lost the 2020 presidential election to Joe Biden, the former vice president in the Obama administration. But he refused to concede, believing there was voter fraud. His diehard supporters, of course, including me, also believed the election was stolen, believing there was widespread voter fraud. Trump's own administration eventually found many types of evidence, but was easily rejected by the Supreme Court, like an idiot. What the fuck is wrong with you, Supreme Court? What's wrong with you? Apparently, Trump's diehard supporters then later said, you know what? I think the only way to prevent Biden from becoming president is only one thing. What? To stop the certification of his victory. Boss AF. Tragically, on January 6, 2021, the day Congress was going to certify Biden's win, Trump sent out an army of his diehard supporters who stormed and invaded the U.S. Capitol. And for hours, they vandalized, looted, and occupied it. For hours. And it resulted in the deaths of 5 people, including 1 police officer. And the National Guard finally came to kick him off after hours of invading. During the fighting, I eventually oversaw on live TV. And I actually endorsed it. I supported it. And I was actually in favor of the attack going on, despite the deaths of 5 people. I'm horrible, I know. There was 5 people killed during that event. But it failed. In the aftermath of the attack, I thought everything was going well. But then, in one of the worst moments in history, Trump's social media accounts have been banned. Oh no! No, Trump's social media accounts! No! But that wasn't the only thing. That was not the only thing that made me sad. Now there was news that made me angry. Because shortly after, Trump, in American history, just literally a week after the attack, became the first president in U.S. history to be impeached twice! You motherfucker! Son! Pelosi, you motherfucker! Son! You should be destroyed! You should be... What the fuck is wrong with you? I fucking hate you! Ah! Although Trump was acquitted just a month later, it wasn't helping things, as I eventually was in depression, apparently. Trump eventually refused to attend Biden's inauguration, which I believe was a good thing, as Trump made the right decision not to attend his inauguration. Apparently, it was not a good place for me in 2020, as it was terrible. On the night of January 19th, as I was sleeping, with tomorrow being Inauguration Day, I prayed to my Lord, my dear Lord Savior, in these words in my sleep. I said, Lord, will you please get rid of the demon responsible for my depression? Avenge the guy who made me laugh, who made me go happy as I thought, and made me joyful. Avenge him you must. Save me from this terrible demise, and annihilate the demon responsible for his losses. And rightfully so, it happened. It happened. It happened. Joe Biden easily had himself sworn in as the 46th president. In the first 100 days of his presidency, he announced a mask mandate, hoping to try and weaken COVID-19. Today, it's a generic thing that's still going on. Biden also signed a $1.9 trillion stimulus check signed by the House. Biden was easily doing poorly on immigration based off of news networks I found on YouTube. And of course, Biden did plan on running for a second term. However, little did he know from the very beginning of his presidency that he and his presidency was not to last. Since Inauguration Day, many of Trump's former diehard supporters had easily wanted to overthrow Biden's presidency altogether. And ever since Inauguration Day, they've been planning to do so. And when the time came, it was here. They decided to do what they couldn't have done on January 6th when they invaded the Capitol first. Invade the U.S. House of Representatives for impeaching Trump. Tragically, on March 30th, they did just that. Eventually, it was starting as peaceful protests, but then they broke through. And just like in the Capitol riot from January, they occupied, vandalized, and looted the House for many hours. Many of the representatives there were easily terrified and evacuated. Shortly after, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi evacuated, fleeing to Baltimore, Maryland, where she was born in 1940. Shortly after, Biden tried calling in the National Guard. However, in a smart, surprising tactic, before the attack on House Representatives, like way before the attack, protesters from the Trump-supporting army easily managed to occupy and take over, loot, vandalize, and, invade many of the bases from the National Guard. This completely screwed up Biden, apparently, as Biden made a bit of an oopsie, apparently. He should have, armed them a bit more. It was not even great. In the end, the House of Representatives was completely occupied and taken over. And President Biden, along with his First Lady, Jill Biden, both said, and then they left the White House. At first, they fled to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where Biden was born in 1942. However, that was occupied with supporters from the Trump army that invaded the House and the National Guard bases from earlier. So instead, Biden fled to a pretty obvious location, Wilmington, Delaware, which is his hometown. Eventually, there, Biden set up an office of the president-electing, which is an office he sort of set up, for the record, after he was elected president in November of 2020, where he was elected. And, he would give that up after he was inaugurated in 2021, the inauguration day. Meanwhile, in the occupation of the House of Representatives, one Trump supporter said, "Hey, I'm gonna try and finish the job." You're not gonna... Oh, boy. Oh, you wouldn't want to do it, would you? Just do what you gotta do, man. Sure thing. Oh boy, this is not looking good. He's going too far. The Trump supporter followed Biden into Wilmington, Delaware, and shortly after, Biden tried to flee into his office of president-electing. However, history repeated itself when he fell down the stairs of Air Force One a few weeks earlier. He actually did the same thing when he was falling down the stairs at home. And because he was 78, it wasn't looking good. The Trump supporter then later spotted him. And shortly after, in one of the most devastating moments of the country, the Trump supporter grabbed a revolver and shot Joe Biden 7 times in the back. The Trump supporter fled to a country where he would never get caught. Meanwhile, back in Wilmington, Biden was seriously hurt, and from his wounds was not looking good, as he was rushed to the nearest hospital near Wilmington and his office. There, on March 31st, 2021, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. At 7:25 a.m., President Biden passed away from his wounds. It was a terrible defeat for the Democrats, and the Democrats would suffer their new worst blow, since their defeat in the election of 1984. Many Biden supporters were devastated, and many were heartbroken by his death. Also in reaction to Biden's death, Nancy Pelosi abdicated her position as Speaker of the House of Representatives, and moving to California, her home state, where she would finally retire from politics forever. Trump supporters, meanwhile, eventually celebrated it in reaction to Biden's death. And even I celebrated, as I was finally rid of that evil dictator. However, the celebrations were cut short, and every one of the Trump supporters who occupied the House of Representatives left and went home and went about their day. Because shortly after, even after Biden's death, who would become the next president now? Apparently, there was now a new politician, eventually taking Biden's place for good. A politician that would seriously be really hard on the opposition and the media. The establishment didn't know what to do, apparently. As she, that's right, I said she, would eventually play by her own rules, hijacking many establishments' game, and being a bit of a controversial president among the Democratic Party, but a great president among the Republicans, despite being on the opposite side. California Senator and Vice President Kamala Harris. Harris will become America's first female president. At the age of 56, she stands as the first female president ever, and also the second person of color as to eventually be president, the first being Obama. But she was also the first South Asian and Indian American woman to be president. Today, Harris stands high as one of America's successful presidents, and I do hope that she might be able to stop COVID-19 for good. I hope so. But that begs the question, what about the upcoming 2024 election? Would I be able to support her or oppose her? Because, on one hand, I do want to support her because I wish she would stop the COVID-19 pandemic that's causing my depression for good. On the other hand, I want to oppose her because what if Donald Trump comes back for a vengeance? Who knows? Who knows, man? Would I support her or oppose her? You decide.